The wedding breakfast at Rosmere Abbey was laid for 40, and the bride had cost less than the epergne of hothouse roses in the middle of the table. She sat at the head of it in dove-gray silk that other people had chosen for her, beside a bridegroom of 35 who looked 60, a duke so wasted that his wedding ring had been wound with thread that morning so it should not slide from his finger, and all around the pair of them the smiling family of Rosmere lifted their glasses of sweet canary wine to the health of a man they had every intention of burying before the first hard frost. Ivy Quayle, who had become Ivy, Duchess of Rosmere, some 40 minutes earlier and did not yet answer to it, lifted her glass with the rest and did what she had done with every cup, bowl, and bottle set before her since she was 7 years old in her father's shop, which was to bring it first to her nose, because an apothecary's daughter drinks nothing she has not asked a question of. Her own glass answered honestly, sweet wine and nothing else. But the Duke's hand shook on the stem of his, as it shook on everything now, and she leaned close to steady it the way a wife may, and as she leaned, rising up off the wine that was his, under the fat sweetness of the canary, faint as a lie told in a kind voice, she caught it. Bitter almond. She did not startle. She had been trained out of startling in a shop where a dropped bottle could be a death, so she settled his napkin for him, and in the settling drew his glass an inch toward her own place, and touched her smallest finger to the wine, and touched the finger to her lip, no more than a bird takes, and let one drop speak on a tongue that had been schooled 14 years for exactly this listening. The drop said laurel water, distilled from the cherry laurel leaf, sweet-smelling, quick in quantity and creeping in little, and in a glass of sugared canary as near to invisible as a poison comes, except to a nose that had been raised on purpose to find it, and there was, so far as Ivy knew, precisely one such nose at that table, and it belonged to the bride nobody had thought worth watching. So she did the only thing there was time to do. She turned to her new husband with a small wifely fuss, murmuring something about his cuff, and in the turning she exchanged the glasses, her clean wine set into his shaking hand, his sweetened death drawn back to stand before her own plate, done in the open, in front of 40 people of rank, and not one of them saw it, because not one of them had ever once looked at her hands, and that, if you will mark it, was the first mistake that family made, and the last one they ever got free of. If you have ever been priced by people who never troubled to ask what you were worth, if you have ever known a thing to be deadly true, and known just as surely that not a soul in the room would take your word for it, then draw your chair into the fire with me now, and if this fireside is one you would sit at again, you know the small kindness that keeps the candles lit, and I am always glad of the company, because what that bought bride did about it, bottle by bottle and page by page through one long autumn, and what was read aloud to the whole assembled county at a winter ball, while a smiling gentleman's face went to pieces by candlelight, is why they still tell this story in that country, and they do not tell it as a tragedy. Mr. Lucian Sedley rose to give the toast. He was the nephew of the Dowager Duchess, a beautifully made man of about 30 with a voice like warmed honey, and he had chosen the wine himself, and had stood at the sideboard being charming to the footman while the glasses were filled. And he spoke very gracefully about new-made joy, and about the spring his dear cousin, the Duke, would surely see now that he had so sweet a reason to mend. And the county murmured and was moved, and everybody drank. The Dowager drank, her eyes bright and steady over the rim, fixed on the Duke. Lord Aubrey, the Duke's young half-brother, drained his glass like a schoolboy and laughed at nothing. And Mr. Lucian Sedley, who had proposed the health, brought his own cup to within an inch of his handsome mouth and did not drink. He set it down untouched. Ivy. Watching the table over the rim of the poison glass she was careful never to let touch her lip, saw the color go quietly out of him, saw his gaze fasten on the Duke swallowing harmless canary that had been hers, and saw in his stillness the particular stillness of a man who has lit a fuse and watched the charge stand up and move to a different room. She lowered her glass without drinking, and under the fall of her shawl she let a thimbleful of that wine down into the little silver-smelling bottle every bride carries against faintness, and stoppered it by feel. And then, being after all only a nervous nobody at a grand table, she contrived to overset the rest across the napery, and there was laughter, kind and unkind, and a footman blotted it away, and the dowager said something gentle about poor child. All this must be very strange to her, and Ivy cast down her eyes and agreed that it was all very strange. And the smelling bottle lay snug in her reticule with a death in it, dated in her memory to the minute. Remember that little bottle. It is the first receipt in a story that is made of receipts. Now, to understand how a bride bought for 200 guineas came to be the only person at that table fit to keep the bridegroom alive, you must go back. First 14 years, and then only 4 months. And the 14 years come first, because nothing in this story happens without them. Elias Quayle kept the apothecary's shop in the market town of Aldenford, a narrow-fronted place with a fat gilt pestle over the door and 100 little drawers inside with the names of the world in Latin on them. And he was a widower, and his whole family was one daughter, and since she could reach the counter by standing on a crate, he had brought her up in the trade exactly as he would have brought up a son, which scandalized the town mildly for years, for she had his hands and better than his nose. He taught her the sweet side first, the syrups and the cordials, and then the working side, the tinctures and the blue pills. And then, when she was 12 and he judged her steady, he taught her the dark side of his own art. Because, as he told her while the rain came down on the shop window, every medicine is a poison that has learned manners, and a dispenser who cannot recognize the poison cannot trust the medicine. And a woman who can smell death in a teacup will never in her life sit helpless in a parlor, whatever else the world does to her. So there were evenings, after the shutters went up, when the lesson was bitter almond, and the lesson was garlic that is not garlic, and the lesson was the sweetish nothing of white arsenic that has no smell at all and must be known by every other sign instead, and he taught her the first law, which was touch. Never swallow. The tongue is a witness and not a glutton. And the second law, which was that poison is a question of dose, for the foxglove that steadies one heart stops another, and the third law, which he made her say back to him like a catechism, that the antidote to most poisons is attention. And everything he knew went into the book. It was a thick quarto bound in scuffed calf, and it held above 1,400 entries in the end. Every poisoning he had ever seen, heard reliably of, or been called to in 30 years of trade, the dose, the signs, the course, the treatment, what saved and what failed to save, all of it set down in a shorthand of his own devising. A private character of hooks and dots that no one else in England could read, because he had invented it to keep his neighbors' worst days from being gossiped through his shop, and he had taught it to exactly one living person, in the evenings, by the light of one candle, to a girl who thought it was a game until the year she understood it was an inheritance. Her father died when she was 19, and there is a bitter little joke in how, for the man who knew every poison in the kingdom was carried off in 9 days, by an honest winter fever that no art of his or hers could turn. And he died holding her hand and telling her, with what breath he had, mind the book, Ivy, and mind the third law. And she was left at 19 with a shop she could run better than any man in the county, and no right in law to run it at all. The lease and stock passed to his brother. Silas Quayle was a draper by trade and a debtor by nature, a man who wore mourning for his brother with real tears in his eyes, and had the shop valued before the month was out, and he kept Ivy on, as he put it, out of Christian feeling, by which he meant that she stood 12 hours a day at the counter doing the dispensing that kept the business alive while he signed papers in the back room that were slowly killing it. And for 4 years she made up the prescriptions and kept the poison register and paid herself nothing. Because a woman with no capital and no husband keeps the roof she has. She was 23, and the shop was drowning in her uncle's notes of hand when the lawyer came from Rosmere. His name was Mr. Bray, and he was dry and gray and exact, and he sat in the back room with Silas for 1 hour, and then Ivy was called in, and the thing was put to her the way you would put a bill of lading, item by item. The Duke of Rosmere, Miss Bray said, was gravely ill, a wasting illness of some 18 months' standing that his physicians did not expect him to see out the winter. It was the wish of his Grace and of his Grace's family that he be married before the end. There were, Mr. Bray said, smoothing the paper before him, reasons of settlement, which need not concern her in their particulars, and the family sought a bride of respectable character, sound health, modest station, and, he paused very slightly at this item, few connections. A young person encumbered with an extensive and inquisitive family, he said, would not suit the quiet of a house of sickness. She would be married quietly, she would be provided for, there would be a jointure of £300 a year secured upon her widowhood, and her uncle's circumstances, Mr. Bray understood, would also be materially eased. 200 guineas to Silas Quayle and the forgiveness of the lease, that was the price. And Ivy stood in her working apron with the faint ochre stain of rhubarb powder worked into the creases of her knuckles, and heard herself sold as precisely as she had ever heard 100 of anything sold. And she looked at Mr. Bray's dry face and understood the whole of it in one held breath, the way her father had taught her to read a label. They did not want a bride. They wanted a widow. They wanted a nobody in decent black who would sign what was put before her, take her 300 a year, and go away leaving no brothers to ask questions and no mother to sit weeping in the hall. And they wanted it done before winter, because dead men cannot be married. And there was something in the marrying, some turn of settlement or entail, that was worth more to that family than the small cost of a girl. Her uncle was already saying, with tears of Christian feeling standing in his eyes, that it was a wonderful thing for her. And Ivy Quayle did her sum as she did every sum, without letting it show on her face. If she refused, she would stand behind her uncle's counter until his debts took the shop, and then she would be a woman of 24 with no capital, no kin worth the name, and a character for being clever, which in a woman is a character for being unmarriageable. If she accepted, she would be a duchess for a winter and a widow, with 300 a year for life, free of Silas, free of Aldenford, mistress of her own mornings until she died. That was the sum as they had written it out for her, and it was a good sum, and she did not believe one line of it, because 18 months of wasting illness in a man of 35 with a hungry family round the bed had a smell to it, and she had been raised to follow her nose. She said she would be honored, and she made one condition, stated so mildly that Mr. Bray granted it without looking up, that she should bring with her, for sentiment's sake, her late father's books and his medicine chest. And so it was that when the Rosmere carriage came for her on a raw October morning, there went into it one small trunk of clothes, one box of dried simples, one locked mahogany chest with a folding scale in it that could weigh a grain of anything, and one thick quarto bound in scuffed calf that held 1,400 deaths and recoveries in a shorthand only she could read. And if the family of Rosmere had known what was in that book, they would sooner have let the devil himself up the abbey steps. Rosmere Abbey stood gray and enormous above its frozen park, 500 years of stone with the winter already sitting on its roofs, and the family received her in the long saloon with a warmth that was pitched, she thought, exactly 1 degree too high. The Dowager Duchess, her new husband's stepmother, was a handsome, upright woman of 60 in lavender silk, born a Sedley, with a voice that stroked and eyes that inventoried, and she took both Ivy's hands and called her my dear child, and looked at her the way a cook looks at a bird already plucked. Lord Aubrey, the Duke's half-brother, a year short of his majority, was all curls and compliments and could not sit still. A boy so plainly in debt and so plainly used to being rescued from it that he wore the fact like a cologne. And Mr. Lucian Sedley, the Dowager's nephew, who had lived at the Abbey, she would learn, for above 2 years, bowed over her hand and said, with a smile of great sweetness, that his cousin was the most fortunate of invalids, and Ivy, 20 minutes inside the door, had already counted the household the way her father counted a sick room, and marked which faces watched her, and which watched each other, and noted, filed, in the place where a foundling of fortune keeps such things, that every person in that warm room spoke of the Duke in a tense that was very slightly wrong, a soft past-flavored tense, the way you speak of a man whose funeral you have already dressed for in your mind. Then they took her up to be presented to him, and that was the first surprise of Rosmere, because she had expected a stranger, and instead, propped gray and gaunt among pillows with the bones showing in his face, she met a pair of dark eyes that were entirely, bitterly, unmistakably awake. Everard, Duke of Rosmere, looked at the girl his family had bought him the way a drowning man looks at one more wave, and when the others had drawn back to the window to murmur, he said to her, "Lo, I am sorry for this, madam. It is none of it my devising. I would not have chosen such a bargain for you." And Ivy, standing plain and steady in her brown traveling dress, answered him just as low, "Nobody chose it for me either, your grace. They only priced it." And something moved behind the bitter eyes then, the first thing in that whole house that had looked at her instead of through her. They were married 2 mornings later in the Abbey chapel, his hand cold in hers and the thread wound round the ring, by special license, with the family ranged behind in their warm smiling row, and the register signed, and the settlement, which had been executed the evening before with Mr. Bray's finger indicating where a bride should write her name, locked away in the muniment room. And then the 40 guests sat down to the wedding breakfast, and the Canary wine came round, and so we are returned to where we began, to a shaking hand steadied, 2 glasses changed in plain sight, and a toast drunk by everyone at that table except the man who proposed it. That night, in the great cold bedchamber they had given her, with her husband of 1 day asleep 3 doors off under the eye of his valet, Ivy Quayle sat by a single candle and did the work of her trade. She dripped wax over the stopper of the silver-smelling bottle and pressed her father's seal ring into it, and wrapped the bottle in paper, and wrote upon the paper the date, the hour, the table, the glass, and the words, "Canary wine, Laurel water, dose short of killing, meant to be seen," and signed her new name to it for the first time in her life, Ivy Rosmere, and locked it into the mahogany chest. And then she sat a long while with her hands folded, thinking, because that last item on the wrapper wanted thinking about. Dose short of killing. She had tasted it, and she knew her trade. There had not been enough in that glass to stop a man, not even a man 3/4 stopped already. There had been enough to double him over before 40 witnesses, to lay him gray and retching in his bed on his wedding night, to write the sentence that every guest would carry home to every drawing room in the county. We saw death on him at his own wedding breakfast. Poor creature. It cannot be long now. The glass had not been the murder. The glass had been the announcement of a murder already 18 months old and running like a slow clock somewhere in that house. And if she wanted the clock, she must find it ticking, and she rather thought she had already heard it. Because at 8:30 that evening, passing the door of the Duke's rooms, she had seen the ritual. The valet was called Fenn, a soft-footed, respectful, buttoned man of 50, who had been recommended into the household, the housekeeper told her later, by the dowager herself some 2 years past. And at 8 in the morning and 8 at night, Fenn measured out a spoonful of the tonic, a dark reddish bitter cordial from a squat green bottle with the label of Dr. Cray's dispensary upon it, prescribed for his Grace's wasting and faithfully given, the one medicine the sick man never missed. And the Duke swallowed it as the dying do, obediently, because it no longer mattered. 6 of those bottles came into the house each month and had done for a year and a half. Ivy stood in the doorway of her marriage, 1 day old, and watched the spoon, and kept her face stupid, and went to bed. In the morning she began the only way she knew, which was at the beginning, with the patient. It was easy enough to sit with him. A new wife dutiful at the bedside raised no eyebrow at all. The family found it touching and rather convenient, and so for 3 days she read to him and fed him his broth and, all the while, without ever seeming to, made the examination her father would have made, and set it down at night in the calf-bound quarto in the shorthand no other eye in England could read. What she found was a page from that book come to life. The skin of his hands and forearms gone thickened and dry, with a scatter of small dark freckles across it like the first spots of rain on a flagstone. The exact raindrop stippling her father had drawn once in the margin of an entry and made her copy till she had it true. The nails ridged across with pale bands, 1 band for each bad bout, so that his fingernails were a calendar of his poisoning if you knew how to count them. And she counted 11 distinct storms. The feet numb, pins and needles waking him at night, so that he had ceased almost to walk not from weakness alone, but because he could not rightly feel the floor. The stomach in constant quiet mutiny, the appetite gone, the flesh gone, the gums sore, and over it all that deep leaden weariness that the family called, in fond carrying voices, poor Everard's decline. Every sign of it sat in her father's book under one heading, and the heading was white arsenic, small doses, long continued, and against the treatment her father had written, in the hooks and dots she could read at a glance, first law of the case, stop the source. All else is embroidery. Stop the source. There was the difficulty that would have sunk a tearful bride, because the source, if she was right, was a respectable tonic from a respectable physician given by a respectable servant in a locked and loving household, and if she cried poison with nothing in her hand but a taste and a theory, she, a shopkeeper's daughter 1 week wed, alone in that family's house, would be sat down gently, spoken of sadly, and packed off to some quiet establishment for hysterical wives before the month was out, and the spoon would go on at 8 and 8 until it finished its work. Her word was worth nothing. She had known that before she ever climbed into the carriage. Very well, said Ivy Quayle to herself, in the voice her father used when a case turned ugly. Then we will not spend words, we will spend proof. And proof is a thing you collect the way you collect simples, in season, with the roots on and labeled. And she began, that same week, the campaign that this story is really about. Not a campaign of scenes and accusations, but of small, dull, unanswerable arrangements, one laid quietly on top of another, the way a pharmacist builds a prescription. First, the food. She let it be known, with a little laugh at herself, blushing, that where she came from a wife cooked for a sick husband with her own hands, it was a superstition of her class, she said, and she knew it was very foolish in a duchess. But she begged the indulgence of the house. The dowager was amused and gracious. Let the little shopwoman play at broths, said her smile, it can hardly signify now, and the kitchen, after one stiff week, discovered that the new duchess made no extra work, kept a corner stove spotless, and was the first gentry the scullery had ever seen who knew what things cost. From that day the Duke ate nothing, drank nothing, tasted nothing that had not been bought by her. From a farm wife she chose herself and paid in coin, carried by her, cooked by her over her own small fire, tasted by her at the pan and at the tray, and served by her own hands, every meal, every day, and the sick-room pantry got a new lock, and the key lived on a ribbon around her neck next to her father's seal ring, and she slept with it. Second, the tonic, and here she was careful, because the tonic was the tripwire. If the spoonful simply stopped, whoever ran the slow clock would know within a week that the bride had smelt the scheme, and a schemer alarmed is a schemer hurried, and a hurried poisoner reaches for the laurel water again, and next time there might be nothing so merciful as a wedding toast to announce it. No, the spoon must go on at 8 and 8, faithful as ever, before witnesses, from the same green bottle, while the thing in the spoon changed. So the new duchess, who had brought her dead father's medicine chest for sentiment's sake, sat up 2 nights compounding, and produced a cordial of gentian, bitter orange, burnt sugar, and a breath of aromatic tincture that matched the tonic in the glass drop for drop. The same dark reddish color against a candle, the same bitter face on the tongue, the same faint medicinal sulk about the cork. Harmless as tea. And on the 3rd night, in the dead hours, she went down to the little cabinet where the month's bottles waited, and she made the first exchange. The full bottle of tonic she took away entire, and in its place stood a bottle identical to the eye, filled with her own blameless bitters, and the bottle she had taken she stoppered fast, dripped wax across, pressed her father's ring into the wax, and wrapped in paper, and on the paper she wrote the date and the shelf and the words taken unopened, contents suspected, and it went into the bottom of the mahogany chest beside the silver-smelling bottle. Bottle by bottle, month by month, as the deliveries came, she did the same, until by Advent there stood in that locked chest a quiet row of sealed green soldiers, each one dated, each one signed. The whole supply of His Grace's tonic from his wedding week onward, untouched, and every spoonful that had actually passed the Duke's lips since the 3rd night of his marriage had been gentian and orange peel and nothing on earth besides. And third, the chart. Every night, last thing, by one candle, she wrote up the day in her father's shorthand, pulse morning and evening, sleep, appetite, what was eaten and how much of it stayed down, the state of the numb feet measured by where a pin's touch woke, the color of the gums, the temper of the man, and she ruled it into columns the way her father ruled his fever charts, so that what was happening to the Duke of Rosmere existed somewhere outside her own word, in dated ink, in a hand that could be proved hers and read, when the day came to read it, aloud, remember the chart. 15 weeks of it were going to be worth more than 1,500 tears. And what the chart showed, within a fortnight, would have been called a miracle in a church, and was called nothing at all in that house, because she was careful to keep it from showing above stairs, was this, that the moment the source stopped, the man began, slowly, doggedly, cell by cell, to climb back toward his life. The sickness of the stomach eased first. Within days, the appetite crept home, and she fed it like a fire. Small and often, eggs and cream and good broth and bread she had proved herself. Sleep came back before the month was out. Real sleep, not the drugged sliding he had called sleep for a year. The pins retreated down his feet a joint at a time, and she charted the retreat like a general. And one gray November morning the Duke of Rosmere stood up from his chair without his stick, walked the length of his bedchamber, stopped at the window with the frost on it, and said, in a voice she had not heard him use before, not the invalid's voice, and not the bitter one, "Madam, what is happening to me?" And Ivy, folding back his shirt cuff to count his pulse, said, "You are mending your grace." And he looked down at her fingers on his wrist, this bought bride who cooked like a farm wife and counted like a physician, and had asked him for nothing in 7 weeks. Not pin money, not kindness, not so much as an hour of his notice. And he said, slowly, "Men do not mend of what I have." And she said, "No, they do not." And let the sentence lie there between them. 1 beat, 2, and then she went on counting his pulse, and he watched her face a long moment. And he was not a stupid man. He had merely been a despairing one, and despair had been part of the dose. He did not ask the next question then, and she was glad, for the next question had answers she could not yet prove. But from that morning he began, without a word said, to be her ally in the concealment, and it was he who thought of the powder. If the family saw him mending, they would know the clock had stopped, so let them see what they looked for. He kept to his chair whenever the dowager sat with him, let his voice fall to threads when Lucian Sedley paid his charming visits, and Ivy, with a shopkeeper's daughter's knowledge of paint and powder, kept his face a careful gray for company, hollowed his eyes with a shadow of ash, and the county was given to understand, through the servants and the physician and the dowager's sighing notes to her friends, that his grace sank week by week, that the sweet new duchess never left his side, that it would be, please God, a peaceful end. Dr. Cray came every Tuesday, a decent puzzled old man who found his patient's pulse stronger every visit and his face worse, and said comfortable contradictory things, and privately thought the tonic he had prescribed was doing better than he had dared hope. And there you may see, if you care to look, exactly how a slow murder hides inside a respectable house, not behind one great lie, but behind a dozen small, honest confusions. A doctor who trusts his own label, a household that trusts the doctor, a county that trusts the household, and one buttoned valet at the seam of it all, measuring out death by the spoon and burning the evidence a bottle at a time in the still-room fire. Or so he believed, for the bottles Fenn now consigned so carefully to destruction held nothing but gentian bitters, and the true bottle slept in wax in a locked chest 3 doors away, growing more eloquent by the month. Christmas drew on, and the family's patience began, very delicately, to fray. Ivy felt it the way you feel weather. The dowager's kindness acquired an edge of management. There was talk, solicitous talk, of nurses being engaged so that the dear child might rest, of the Duke being moved to warmer rooms on the south front, away, Ivy noted, from her own, of Dr. Cray being helped by a cleverer man from town, some physician the Sedleys knew. Each of these kindnesses she met with soft, immovable stupidity. The meek bride, too, devoted to be pried loose, too dull to be suspected of anything but sentiment. And Mr. Lucian Sedley, who had watched his wedding toast fail to announce anything, and had waited, with the patience of his kind, through October and November for the wasting to finish its work, began to walk past the sick room a little too often, and to ask the footman light questions about what his grace ate. And one afternoon in mid-December there arrived at the Abbey, addressed to the Duke in a hand nobody recognized, with the compliments of an old friend in town, a handsome box of candied apricots. Ivy took delivery of it herself, smiled at it, praised it, carried it upstairs, and did not so much as let it stand uncovered in the sick room. That night she opened the box in her own chamber, and took up one apricot with her father's ivory forceps, and made the examinations of her trade, and found the sugar at the heart of 3 of them, gritty with something that had no business in a sweetmeat. And she did not weep, or rage, or run to her husband. She wrapped the box entire in paper, sealed it, dated it, wrote across the wrapper received by post, sender unknown, 3 fruits doctored, and set it in the chest beside the green bottles, the smelling bottle and the growing chart, and stood a moment looking down at her quiet arsenal, and said aloud, to the candle, to her father, to nobody, they are hurrying now. And they were hurrying, and she still did not know, that mid-December night, the one fact that would turn her defense of one man into justice for 2 women, because she had not yet seen the inside of Mrs. Holloway's cupboard, and it was Mrs. Holloway's cupboard, opened a week later over a question of linen that turned a poisoning into a pattern. And I will tell you now, because you have sat with me this far, that what waited in that cupboard was a dead woman's housekeeping, and the dead keep the best accounts of all. Mrs. Holloway had kept the keys of Rosmere Abbey for 26 years, a spare, upright woman with a face like a closed ledger, and she had watched the new Duchess through the autumn the way she watched all things, silently and in double entry. And somewhere around the 2nd month the balance had come out in Ivy's favor, for reasons Mrs. Holloway would have put if anyone had asked her in terms of housekeeping. The girl wasted nothing, wrote things down, paid the farm wife on the day, and kept her word to servants, which in Mrs. Holloway's experience was rare enough in gentry to be worth the keeping. So when the Duchess came asking, that week before Christmas, about the old linen inventories, wanting to know how the sick room had been provisioned in years past, Mrs. Holloway unlocked the tall cupboard in her parlor where the household books of 30 years stood ranked like soldiers, and left her to them, and that ordinary courtesy was the hinge on which everything after turned, because the books remembered what the family had agreed to forget. Ivy had come looking for linen, and she found, in the diet books of 7 years back, a ghost of her own handwriting, sick-room diets, day upon day, for her grace, arrowroot, thin broth, the invalid's climbing down ladder of a failing appetite, and beside it in the cellar book, the record of a cordial had 6 bottles the month for her grace's wasting, and in the wage book the entry of a new under-nurse taken on, and then 19 months from the first thin broth, in a black-edged line. The funeral meets for Honora, Duchess of Rosmere, dead at 29 of a wasting illness, and Ivy sat in the housekeeper's parlor with the winter light failing and the books open before her, and felt the cold walk up her arms. Because she had known there was a first wife, the county had mentioned her the way counties mention the dead, sadly and briefly. Poor Duchess Honora, such a fading. And the Duke had never once spoken her name. But nobody, not one soul in that talking county, had ever said the one thing the book said plainly in 3 different inks, that the first Duchess of Rosmere had died over 19 months of exactly the decline that was now, 7 years later, killing her husband. Same signs by every diet that was ordered for her. same tonic by the cellar book, same season of onset, same slow ladder down. She went through the visitor's ledger next, the record every great house keeps of who slept under its roof and when, and there it was, laid out neat as a prescription. Mr. Lucian Sedley, resident at the Abbey from 2 months before the first Duchess began to fail until 3 weeks after her funeral. Then gone. To town. To the continent. To wherever charming men go to wait, gone through all the healthy years, and resident again from 2 months before the Duke's own wasting began until this present hour. 2 declines, 19 months and 18. 1 guest. She copied the entries by candle, dates and pages, in fair round hand, and then she did a thing that took more nerve than the copying. She asked Mrs. Holloway, over the teapot, easily, what had become of the first Duchess's own maid. And the closed ledger of Mrs. Holloway's face opened just a crack, for the first time in 26 years. Her name was Patience Crick, the housekeeper said at last, and she was turned off the week after the funeral, with a full year's wages, which nobody in this house ever had before or since, and she wanted to speak to somebody before she went, and was not let, and Mrs. Holloway set the teapot down and looked at the new Duchess a long level moment, and said, quietly, I have kept the books of this house since before your Grace was born, and books do not grieve, and they do not imagine. They only add. And I have done the adding many times over, alone, at night. And I will say to you what I have never said aloud to a living soul, which is that if your Grace has begun some work in this house, then the books are at your Grace's disposal, and so am I. You should know what that cost her, for a housekeeper's whole life is discretion. And Ivy took her hand, which is not a thing duchesses did, and from that evening there were 2 of them. Now the work went with double speed, and it went outward, because a pattern inside the house wanted proof from outside it, proof no family advocate could wave away as servant's fancy. The tonic bottles came, by the label, from Dr. Cray's dispensary. And Dr. Cray's dispensing was honest. She had verified that herself in November, buying a bottle by a servant's hand straight from his shop and testing it in her chamber, iron and cinchona, blameless, which meant the poison went into the bottles after they entered the Abbey and before they reached the spoon, in the pantry passage where the medicine hamper stood, on Fenn's quiet watch. And if Fenn was doctoring 6 bottles a month for 18 months, he was using white arsenic in steady ounces. And steady ounces have to be bought somewhere, and by the law and custom of the trade. In any chemist's shop in the kingdom, poison is entered when sold, in a register, with the buyer's name, the quantity, the stated purpose, and the date. In ink, forever, her father had kept such a register. She had kept it for him. And so, 2 days after Christmas, the Duchess of Rosmere had herself driven into the grey stone village below the park, to the shop of Mr. Pettifer, chemist and druggist, on the errand, all the household understood, of buying dried lavender and hartshorn, and Mr. Pettifer, a round, anxious little man who had inherited the shop from his father, bowed her in among his 100 labeled drawers, and found, to his growing astonishment, that the Duchess talked his trade like a dispenser, asked after his winter stock of cinchona like a colleague, and then, when the shop stood empty and his boy had been sent to the cellar, laid one gloved hand flat upon his counter and said, in a voice pitched for him alone, Mr. Pettifer, I am an apothecary's daughter before I am anything else that has lately happened to me. My father was Elias Quayle of Aldenford. You will know the name. And I am going to ask you to do a thing that frightens you, and I ask it because lives sit upon it, one of them mine. I wish to see your poison register. He knew the name. Every chemist within 40 miles had known Elias Quayle, and the register was the law's book as much as his own, and still his hands shook as he brought it up. Because a village chemist lives at the pleasure of the great house, and he was no fool. He had done his own adding, in the dark, more than once, and had put the sum away from him. The register lay open between them on the counter, and Ivy turned the leaves back through 2 years, and there they were, in a soft, respectful clerk's hand, signed each time in the same buttoned signature. J. Fenn. For the household of Rosmere Abbey, white arsenic, 2 ounces, for the rats in the West Granary. 11 entries, spaced steady as quarter days through 18 months. 11 storms for 11 pale bands on a dying man's fingernails, and further back, 7 years back, in the elder Pettifer's crabbed hand, the same signature 9 entries more, for the rats. Always for the rats. Through precisely the 19 months of the first Duchess's fading, and not one entry in the healthy years between. And at the last leaf but one, dated 2 days before her own wedding, an entry that stopped her breath for exactly 1 count, she allowed it 1. No more. Distilled laurel water, 4 ounces, for the relief of Mr. Sedley's cough, collected, said the entry, by Mr. Sedley's own man. She had tasted that cough in a glass of Canary wine on her wedding morning. Mr. Pettifer copied every entry fair, both hands trembling, and certified each page in his own writing as a true extract, and signed. And when he had done, he took off his spectacles and said, simply, "My father before me sold to this signature, and thought no wrong, and I sold to it, and I have lain awake over the granary rats of Rosmere, madam, more nights than I can bill anybody for. And if there is a magistrate some day wants the book itself, the book will be here, and so will I." Now she had the pattern and the purchases. She wanted the eyes, the living witness who had stood in the first sick room, and so a letter went south, 2 counties south, where the wage book said Patience Crick had gone home to marry. A careful letter that named no crimes, only asked in kindness for her recollections of her late mistress's illness, and what came back 3 weeks later was worth more than all the rest together. A letter written for Patience by a parson's daughter, and sworn by Patience before a justice of the peace of her county, her mark witnessed. Because Patience Crick had spent 7 years waiting for somebody to ask, and what she swore was this: that her mistress in her illness could keep down nothing but what Mr. Sedley's kindness sent up to her, that the tonic was given always and only from that gentleman's hand or the valet's, that whenever Mr. Sedley was called away her mistress mended 3 separate times, and sickened again within the week of his returning, that she, Patience, had said as much once, only once, to the dowager's own maid, and within the month her mistress was dead, and Patience was paid a year's wages to be gone, and told that a girl who repeated wicked fancies about her betters would never take a character with her, and that she had carried it 7 years like a stone in her chest, and would swear it before any court in England, and might God forgive her the silence, for she had been 18, and alone, and afraid, and she was neither of the first 2 things any longer. Ivy read that letter twice, sealed a copy into the chest, and sat a long time looking at the fire, and I will tell you what she was thinking, because it is the coldest and most necessary thought in this whole story. She was thinking that everything in the chest, the bottles, the register extracts, the apricots, the letter, the chart, all of it together, was still not safe to spend. Because evidence is like any other coin, it buys nothing until it is spent in the right market. And the right market was not a family council in the saloon, where the dowager would weep at the insult, and Lord Aubrey would bluster, and Mr. Sedley would smile his pained, forgiving smile, and speak of the strain upon a young wife's nerves, and every door in that house would close like water over the whole matter, and one dark night thereafter the new duchess would take a fall on the stairs or a chill that went to her lungs, and the county would sigh. No, the market for this coin was public, formal, and irreversible sworn voices, an officer of the law, and witnesses of such rank and number that the story could never afterward be stuffed back into the bottle, and as it happened, the family itself was building the very room. Because the dowager, serene in her certainty that the Duke was sinking at last, had set the abbey to preparing a winter ball for the coming of age of Lord Aubrey. Invitations to the whole county, 200 candles ordered, the heir presumptive to be toasted under the sick man's own roof, and one has to grant the plan its economy. The county assembled to admire the heir would be the same county assembled so soon after for the funeral. Ivy looked at the fire and thought, in her father's voice, very well. You have chosen the room. We will choose the play. It was that same week she told the Duke everything, because the time for half-truths was over, and the plan needed him. She told it in order, as a case, the chest open on the table between them, and she watched her husband, who now walked his dressing room an hour a day with a straight back, and let the world believe he could not cross it, take up each sealed thing in turn, the green bottles in their dated row, the chemist's extracts with the granary rats marching down the page, the box of apricots, the little silver-smelling bottle from the wedding breakfast. And it was the smelling bottle that stopped him, because until that moment he had not known, she had never told him, what his bride had done at his own wedding table on the first morning of their acquaintance, and he stood holding the small silver thing with the wax on it, and looked at her and said, in a voice scraped down to the wood, You drank nothing at our wedding, madam. I remember it. They laughed at you for spilling your wine, and you had a death in your reticule, and you sat through the toasts and said nothing. And you have said nothing since October. And Ivy answered, There was nothing yet worth saying. Your Grace, there was only worth doing. And the Duke of Rosmere, who had watched his own blood price his coffin and had let despair dose him as surely as the arsenic, sat down slowly, with the last letter, Patience Crick's letter, in his hand, and read what had been done to Honora. And when he lifted his face, it was not grief in it, or not grief alone, it was the return, after 7 drugged and darkened years, of the man his tenants had once called the just Duke, and he said, quietly, they starved me of the will to ask questions, and I let them. That is my share of this, and I will carry it. But, madam, they made you my food taster on your wedding morning. They made my wife stand sentry over every mouthful I have eaten since October. And he stopped, and mastered it, and said only, Tell me the plan, and do not soften it. So she told him, and he heard it through, and added to it 2 things she could not supply, the first being Sir Hugo Fairhurst. Sir Hugo was the county's senior magistrate, an old iron-gray friend of the Duke's dead father, honest as frost and about as warm, and he came to the Abbey one fog-bound January morning, ostensibly to take a sad farewell of a sinking man, and spent 3 hours behind a locked door instead, being walked, exhibit by sealed exhibit, through the contents of a mahogany chest by a young woman in gray, who answered every question he could devise without once decorating an answer, and Sir Hugo had spent 40 years listening to testimony, and said afterward that he had never in his life met a witness so entirely devoid of performance, and that it was the shorthand chart that had turned him. A whole winter of dated observations in a dead apothecary's cipher, translated aloud at his elbow, while he checked the dates against the bottle's seals. Because juries and magistrates may doubt a wife's tears, but they warm wonderfully to a wife who can produce her workings. Sir Hugo took depositions there and then, from the Duchess, from Mrs. Holloway, from the Duke, sent his own clerk south to verify Patience Crick's oath and his own letter to 2 physicians of the county town, arranging for the sealed bottles to be opened, tested, and certified under witness, and undertook, with a grim relish he did not trouble to hide, to be present, entirely by social acts at Lord Aubrey's coming-of-age ball. And the second thing the Duke added was simpler, and you will forgive him for it. He insisted on the setting. Not a private laying of information, not a quiet arrest at dawn with the family's advocates smothering the tale by noon, but the receipts read out in the lit and crowded long gallery of Rosmere Abbey, before the whole invited county, in the very room where that family had rehearsed his funeral, because, he said, taking his wife's hand, they did their murdering behind curtains and their mourning in public. Madam, we shall reverse the arrangement for them, and if that sentence has a cold ring to it, remember that he had a wife dead 7 years, who had mended 3 times whenever her poisoner left the house, and had been given back to him at last as 19 months of diet book entries in a housekeeper's cupboard. There remained only the waiting, and one last piece of luck that was not luck at all, but Mrs. Holloway's doing, for in the last week of January, with the ball 5 days off, the housekeeper, going soft-footed about her linen at an hour when the passage lamps were down, saw Mr. Lucien Sedley stop the valet fen by the still-room door and pass into his hands a small paper packet, and heard him say, in that warmed honey voice, "The last of it now, John. Before the house fills, let it be a strong finish." And Mrs. Holloway walked on with her candle like a woman who had seen nothing, and reported it within the quarter hour, word for word, dry as an inventory. And that night the bottle fen doctored went, as every bottle had gone for 3 months, into the locked chest with wax over its stopper, the freshest soldier in the row, sealed this time before 3 witnesses, the Duchess, the housekeeper, and the butler, Mr. Grieve, each of whom signed the wrapper. And the spoon at 8 and 8 went on serving gentian bitters, and the Duke of Rosmere, gray with ash shadow and leaning beautifully on a stick he did not need, let his relations see him helped to a sofa, and the abbey filled with hothouse flowers and hired musicians, and the county's carriages were promised down every frozen road, and now you have every piece upon the board, the poisoner hurrying toward his strong finish, the poison going faithfully into a locked chest instead of a living man, the magistrate invited, the physician's certificate signed and folded in Sir Hugo's breast pocket, the chemist and his register standing by, and a hostess in dove-gray silk who had spent her whole life learning that the antidote to most poisons is attention. And so we come, at last, to the night of the winter ball. The county came through the snow by the carriage load, and the long gallery of Rosmere Abbey burned with its 200 candles, and Lord Aubrey was toasted at 10 o'clock, flushed and curly and 21, and the dowager stood beside him in wine-dark velvet, receiving the county's congratulations and its murmured condolences in the same gracious breath, for everyone had heard how low the Duke was sunk, and so there is no describing the sound the room made, a sort of soft general gasp with music dying inside it, when the doors at the far end opened at 10:30, and the Duke of Rosmere came in, unannounced, on no stick, with color in his face and his Duchess in dove-gray silk upon his arm, and walked the whole length of that gallery through his frozen guests at an easy pace, and took a glass of nothing from a footman, and said, "Into the silence, friends, you find me risen, and my physician amazed, and my family, I perceive, astonished. And before we drink to my brother, again, I have asked Sir Hugo Fairhurst to read the company a little of my household's accounts, for it is by accounts that this house has been kept alive." And Sir Hugo stepped out of the crowd with a leather case under his arm and no smile whatever, and what followed took 40 minutes, and nobody in that gallery ever forgot a minute of it. He read the chemist's certified extracts first, plainly, dates and quantities. White arsenic, 2 ounces, for the rats in the West Granary, 11 entries in 18 months over the signature J. Fenn, and 9 more, 7 years old, matched day for day against the fading of Honora, late Duchess of Rosmere, and while the county was still working that arithmetic, he had Mr. Pettifer, scrubbed and terrified and steady, swear to his register. And then the steward swore that no rat-catching had been bought for the West Granary in 10 years, and then the physician's certificate was read, that the sealed bottles of His Grace's tonic, opened under witness, held iron, cinchona, and arsenic enough to finish a strong man in a season. Each bottle dated in wax under the seal of the Duchess, an unbroken chain from the wedding week to 5 days past, and the last bottle sealed before 3 witnesses on the very night. Sir Hugo paused here, and did not raise his voice. On the very night a person of this household was heard to require of the valet a strong finish before the house filled. The music had long stopped. The county stood like a field under frost. Every face turned, not to Sir Hugo, but to where Mr. Lucian Sedley stood near the dowager with a glass in his hand and his charm dying on him by inches, in patches, the way ice goes off a pond. And Ivy, watching him as she had watched him across a wedding table in October, saw the exact moment the smiling machinery stopped, which was not the arsenic and not the bottles. It was when Sir Hugo unfolded the sworn letter of Patience Crick and read to the gallery how a mistress had mended 3 times when one guest left the house and sickened within the week of his 3 returnings, and a young maid had been bought silent with a year's wages while her lady faded to the churchyard. And at that, Lucian Sedley set his glass down on a marble table, very carefully, with a small click that carried the length of the room. The same gesture. One witness to the wedding breakfast whispered afterwards, the very same, and made for the door, and found 2 of Sir Hugo's constables standing in it dressed as footmen, and stopped, and turned, and gave the room one last try, the pained, forgiving smile, the word hysteria half formed on his lips, and the room looked back at him with 200 candles' worth of perfect understanding. And the smile went out, and what his face did then, in front of the assembled county, was the confession, and everyone present said so, in letters, for weeks. Fenn was taken that same hour at the still-room door, with a paper of white arsenic sewn into his waistcoat, and being a buttoned practical man, he weighed his neck against his loyalty before midnight, and gave the whole of it to Sir Hugo's clerk. The packets passed in the passage, the bottles doctored in the pantry, the laurel water fetched for the wedding wine, all at the direction, first and last, over 9 years and 2 poisonings, of Mr. Lucian Sedley, who had stood to govern Rosmere through a pliable boy the moment the Duke was safely buried behind a settlement of his own aunt's contriving. As for the dowager, no paper carried her name and no witness her voice. She had built as the clever build, in other men's handwriting, and the law never touched her. But the county did, which in that world was the longer sentence, and she removed within the month to a tall cold house in Bath, where she lived out her years magnificently dressed, universally received, and never once, in any room in England, left alone again with anyone's teacup. Lord Aubrey, white as the tablecloth, was the only one of them who crossed the gallery that night, and he crossed it in front of everyone, to his brother, and said loud enough to be heard, "I did not know, Everard. I swear before God I did not know, and the pity of it is that it was true. He had been the pension, not the partner, kept soft and in debt and incurious, and the Duke looked at him a long moment and said, Then learn what you were worth to them, brother. It is written in the accounts. And afterwards gave him neither exile nor absolution, but a commission in the north, and the whole truth in writing, which was harder than either, and made a man of him in the end. At the spring assizes fens evidence, and the register, and the seals, and the letter did their work in less than a day. And the law of that time dealt with Lucian Sedley, as the law of that time dealt with poisoners. And the county did not mourn, and I will leave it there, for this fireside deals in justice, not in relish. And now the story owes you its last debt, which is the two of them, because a marriage made by purchase and preserved by chemistry is not yet a marriage, and nobody knew that better than the Duke. In April, with the park gone green, he came to her still room where she was cutting labels and laid on her bench a folded parchment, and it was not a love letter, it was a deed executed irrevocable. The freehold of a good stone house and shop in Aldenford with an east window, and funds of her own in her own sole name, enough for a life, and annulment papers drawn and lacking only signatures. And he said, "You were sold to me, madam, and I will not keep what was sold. So there is your liberty, whole, in your hand, whatever you choose next." And having said that, and only having said that, he asked, would she consider, now that she was free and it could never again be anyone's bargain, becoming his wife in earnest? For he had loved her, he said, since the morning a bought bride spilled her wine to save a stranger's life and asked no credit for it, and he did not want a nurse, or a duchess, or a rescue. He wanted the one person in England who could not be deceived at his table or anywhere else, and Ivy Quayle, who had faced down a county without her hands shaking, found them shaking now, and set down her knife, and gave him her terms. For of course she had terms. The poison book stays and is taught, a dispensary for the estate villages with her own name over its door, the housekeeper pensioned in honor, the physic garden replanted, and Sundays, every Sunday, he would eat what she cooked with her own hands at her own small fire. And the Duke of Rosemeer said, "Madam, I had rather eat at your fire than reign anywhere." And they were married again in May, quietly, by choice this time, with Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Pettifer and Patience Crick sitting in the front pew, which told the county everything about the new order of that house. The Rosemeer Dispensary stands in the village to this day, and for 30 years the Duchess kept its books and trained its girls, farm daughters, and foundlings, each one taught to smell before she sips and to write her workings fair. And in the Abbey Library, on a stand of its own, lies a scuffed calf quarto of 1,400 entries with a winter of shorthand chart bound in at the back, and beside it, under glass, a small silver smelling bottle still sealed, which the Duke would never permit to be opened, because, he said, it held the first thing his wife ever gave him, which was the rest of his life. If this story found you somewhere warm tonight, I am glad you were here for it, and tell me in the comments which moment you would have crossed that gallery for, the two glasses changing places in front of 40 blind guests, or the little click of a cup set down on marble as the letter was read. And tell me, too, what town or what country you are listening from, for this fireside reaches farther every week, and I do like to know how far the candles carry. Next Thursday, another door opens on another woman the world priced too cheap, a linen draper's daughter this time, and a locked conservatory, and a will that everyone in the family had read except the one page that mattered, and it is waiting for you when you are ready. The Abbey is quiet now on winter nights, the gallery dark, the candles cold in their sockets. But in the still room, under the window, a ruled chart hangs framed where the morning light crosses it, hooks and dots in a dead man's cipher, and at the foot of it, in a clear round hand that learned its letters behind a shop counter, One line set down for whoever comes after. The antidote to most poisons is attention.